Hello, and welcome to today's panel, The Rohingya Refugee Crisis, Reflections from the Region. My name is Madeline Gleeson, and I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Cowdell Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW Sydney. I am chairing this panel from Australia, where we have a practice of opening meetings such as this by acknowledging the traditional inhabitants and custodians of the land. This is an important practice here, and especially relevant when we meet to discuss forced displacement, belonging, and homelands. So with that in mind, I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I join you today, and their elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which all of you join us today, whether that be in Australia or from around the world. The Cowdell Centre is delighted to be hosting today's panel as part of the global conference being held this month to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Statute of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. We have a stellar lineup of speakers. Keen Shum is a Senior Policy Officer for the Myanmar situation at the UNHCR Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific, based in Bangkok, Thailand. He has also previously worked on mixed movements and refugee status determination for UNHCR. Wei Wei Nu is the founder and executive director of the Women Peace Network in Myanmar. She spent 7 years as a political prisoner in Burma, and since her release from prison in 2012, has dedicated herself to working for democracy and human rights. In addition to the Women Peace Network, Nu has also founded the Yangon Youth Centre, and amongst her many awards and accolades has been named as a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, recognised as a Next Generation Leader by Time magazine, and named as one of the Financial Times' Women of the Year. Phil Robertson is the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. He oversees the organisation's work throughout Asia, with special focus on Southeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. He serves as a human rights advocate, engaging with government and UN agency officials, a strategic campaigner on rights cases and causes, and a researcher and writer on topics of human rights, labour rights, refugees, and migration. Dato Stephen Wong is a co-convener of the Asia Dialogue on Forced Migration and the former Deputy Chief Executive and member of the board of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. In that position, he oversaw foreign policy and security studies, while simultaneously heading the Institute's economics and social work. And unfortunately, our fifth panellist, Saw Mint, will be unable to join us today. Our speakers today are going to be reflecting on the Rohingya refugee crisis, which is one of the most significant and ongoing refugee crises in our region. In 2015, the world watched on in horror as thousands of Rohingya and Bangladeshis were abandoned at sea by smugglers and left adrift, before being abandoned again by neighbouring countries, which refused, at least at first, to rescue these people or allow disembarkation. In the aftermath of that crisis, there was a flurry of activity as various groups of states and other stakeholders met to review what had happened and make plans and pledges to respond better to future instances of large-scale displacement. In August 2017, another exodus of Rohingya began as 750,000 people fled into neighbouring Bangladesh. Then again, just last year, we saw more boats of Rohingya in the same waters as 2015, pushed back from the same countries, again unable to disembark safely and access protection. Nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees remain in camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. Transfers of people to the Bangladeshi island of Bhasan Char have also begun. The possibility of repatriation has been floated at various times, but very real concerns remain about whether the conditions for a safe and dignified return are in place. Meanwhile, Rohingya elsewhere in the region struggle with a variety of protection concerns. This is the situation to which our panellists are turning their attention today, with a specific eye to the future and possible solutions. Each of our speakers will give a short presentation, and then we will have time for questions. So I encourage all of you today, please, to post your questions in the Q&A forum and vote for other questions which you would like answered. Without further ado, I now invite Keen Shum to give his presentation on behalf of UNHCR.
Thank you very much, Madeline, to you and the Caldor Center for organizing this event and asking us to be a part of it. I'm sorry my colleague Samint couldn't join, but I'll incorporate the messages he was going to share into some of the points I'll make. So for UNHCR, and you mentioned the 70th anniversary of our statute, the Rohingya situation really touches upon every part of our mandate. The nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees across the region, mostly in Bangladesh, but also in Malaysia, India, and elsewhere. Some 600,000 Rohingya who remain in Rakhine State in Myanmar, but stateless because they, like the refugees too, are denied citizenship in Myanmar. And among those 600,000, around 140,000 internally displaced in Myanmar as a result of conflict. Now, all of them, of course, are in need of both protection and solutions. And those are the two angles from which we're trying to tackle the situation. They're obviously closely linked. In Myanmar, maintaining humanitarian and protection space for Rohingya communities is the necessary first of many steps towards the eventual voluntary repatriation of Rohingya refugees. Whereas in host countries, they understandably want to see progress on solutions if they're going to maintain humanitarian and protection space for refugees. So on the protection side, to kind of give you an overview of the current situation, in Myanmar, the focus of our advocacy is on restoring the rights of the Rohingya, particularly their freedom of movement and citizenship, which remain restricted. Operationally, we're on the ground in Rakhine assessing community needs and implementing community projects under a tripartite MOU we have with UNDP and the government of Myanmar to create conditions that would one day be conducive to the voluntary return of refugees in safety and dignity and in a sustainable way. Our access is limited but growing, and we hope to be able to expand some of these projects so that all communities in Rakhine can have greater access to education, livelihoods, healthcare, other basic services. But the security situation in Rakhine has deteriorated since 2019 because of the armed conflict between the ethnic Rakhine, our Rakhine army, and the Myanmar military. That has intensified, and our operation is also focused on delivering assistance to the mostly ethnic Rakhine communities displaced by that conflict. We have seen some positive developments since the recent elections in Myanmar, with a Japanese special envoy brokering a truce between the Arakan army and military that is holding for now. Across the Naf River in Bangladesh, which hosts 860,000 Rohingya refugees, we've worked with the government there on a huge effort to prevent COVID-19 from spreading through the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, which has largely been successful thanks to the government's inclusion of refugees in the national pandemic response. And the prevention and the treatment health facilities that we built as part of the response will serve refugees, but also host communities for years to come. And that's the kind of example of sort of mutual, beneficially consultative and community-based kind of approach that we think can be taken to address some of the challenges that have arisen recently in Bangladesh and other host countries. There have been security concerns and some violent episodes in the camps in Cox's Bazar recently. And we think the response should be, in consultation with the communities, encouraging social cohesion rather than division. The government's response has, however, been to, for example, build fences and to securitize the response to some extent. And of course, separately, as you mentioned, to push ahead with the relocation of several thousand refugees now in Bhasan Char in the Bay of Bengal. In the other host countries in Malaysia and India, which are sometimes forgotten about, they do still host significant populations of Rohingya, about 100,000 in Malaysia and 20,000 in India, at least those that are registered with us. And unfortunately, over the last year, we've seen increasing use of detention on Rohingya refugees for indefinite periods without access to us or other humanitarian actors. And then across the region, as you mentioned also, we've seen how the lack of education and livelihood opportunities and solutions has driven an increase in Rohingya attempting boat journeys just over the last year, not on the same scale as we saw in 2015 and the years before that, but quite a significant increase over at least the more recent years, and with several hundred dying at sea as countries hesitated to rescue and disembark them, not unlike the 2015 boat crisis. So all these protection concerns really underscore how the challenges will only increase as the situation becomes more protracted, and however much humanitarian space or even funding that we manage to maintain, the status quo is unsustainable. And that seemed to be the sentiment expressed at an international conference in October that some of you may have observed on sustaining support for the Rohingya response. Many countries at the conference, including several from the region, called for a comprehensive and a regional approach to securing solutions for the Rohingya. So the question we all face now is what that might look like and how it could be achieved. So to start, I think it's clear we need to better understand how Rohingya communities envision their future in Myanmar, but also as they wait to return to Myanmar. We do that through our consultation with the refugees, but also rely on partners who are similarly trusted by the communities. We know that any comprehensive approach will need to be anchored in enabling voluntary return and therefore improving conditions significantly in Rakhine State on a much bigger scale than we or our partners can do under our MOU, for example. Now, there is a blueprint for this, I think as many of you will know, accepted by both the international community and the Myanmar government. And those are the recommendations of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State that was chaired by Kofi Annan. Significantly sort of scaled up support for implementing those recommendations, whether it's political or technical or financial, could really help sort of meaningfully make those changes, which also address Rakhine grievances and would really pave the way for peace for all communities in Rakhine State. And it can start in areas where there is more potential for improving conditions, where it's more accessible, where maybe it's less affected by the current conflict. For UNHCR, an important part of building confidence in the prospect of return is also upholding refugees' right to return. And so we're seeking to lend our technical expertise to ensuring that Myanmar verifies refugees as inclusively as possible. Now, while that effort is underway or emerging in Myanmar, hopefully, and to help generate momentum for that effort, there are immediate needs that some refugees have that can and sometimes can only be addressed in third countries. So increased resettlement generally would certainly be welcome, but also complementary pathways to countries in the region, but also beyond. And that means community sponsorship programs where that's possible, education pathways, labor mobility programs for refugees who might be eligible. And I know one proposal we wanted to put on the table that I know Samint wanted to share was, can neighboring countries in the region work together to reunite Rohingya families across borders? Many have been separated along their journeys. And instead of leaving those families to once again resort to people smugglers, can there be some kind of legal mechanism within the region for at least families or at least children to be reunited with their parents? Now, there are obviously only ever going to be a limited number of these kinds of pathways. And in all cases, refugees would necessarily maintain their right to return to Myanmar. But expanding these pathways over a multi-year period would I think demonstrate some real equitable burden sharing from the international community, which would give host countries the space to adopt more inclusive measures, particularly on education and livelihoods, which in turn would reduce refugees' vulnerability to exploitation, criminality, and their motivation to attempt some of the risky bone journey we've seen. So you can see how what often feels like a vicious cycle of discrimination and conflict and displacement could instead be a virtuous cycle of opportunity, inclusion, peace. And it will, of course, take a substantial concerted international effort with governments doing more than they have, contributing more than just funds, more than even those third country pathways, but also lending their diplomatic and political weight to encouraging dialogue between Myanmar and Bangladesh, between ASEAN and Bangladesh, within ASEAN, across the region. It sounds like a bit of a moonshot, but we've seen even in just the last few months how different countries in the region can take the initiative to make potentially game-changing positive contributions and turn what had seemed like dead ends into paths for progress. So the Arakan Army conflict had seemed to be intensifying without end until the Japanese special envoy suddenly intervened and gained the trust of both sides. After the increase in boatments that we did see last year, just when it seemed like no country in the region was willing to take in Rohingya refugees, the Philippines made a generous offer to do just that. So I think that's the case that needs to be made by all of us in our advocacy with the key actors, that a kind of constellation of individual contributions from a coalition of actors can together comprehensively solve the Rohingya crisis. And that this needs to happen now, while refugees retain some sense of hope for return, while there are positive developments to build on, because the alternative is really in no one's interest. And the longer the status quo prevails, the more harm it will do to Myanmar's development and democratization, to regional relationships and security, and of course to a whole generation of Rohingya youth and children.
Thank you very much, Keen. That was a very comprehensive and informative opening to this topic, which really helps set up the conversation that is now going to follow. Our next speaker is Wei Wei Nu, who will be speaking to some groundbreaking research about to be published in a forthcoming article that she has co-authored with several colleagues, which is looking at sexual violence against Rohingya women at sea, particularly those who fled across the Andaman Sea. This research is due to come out this year in the Asia Pacific Journal on Human Rights and the Law, and so we're thrilled to have Wei Wei here today to give us an advanced preview into her findings and speak to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeline. It's a privilege to co-author this important piece, and it's an honor to join you all. Thank you for the opportunity to join in this discussion today. Thank you, Kane, for providing your insights. So as Madeline said, I'll be focusing on specifically on the experiences of women on the sea, covering the gender-based sexual violence. Regarding the broader questions around the refugees, I will answer during the question and answer session, so feel free to drop me any questions you may have in terms of bigger picture. So on this article that we're working on, the key issue that we are covering is the issue that the experiences of the refugees, specifically the experiences of refugees that are gendered. Although we have like international treaties addressing women's rights, such as CEDAW, we continue to see globally a lack of recognitions and specific measures to address the experiences of these women and girls. So this is the exemplary in the experience of women and girls during the Andaman Sea crisis in 2015. Just to give context, as you know, the Rohingya women and girls are fleeing a context which is being investigated at the International Criminal Court as a crime against humanity. This is an extensive documentation. There is an extensive documentation of the experiences of women and girls now public as part of the UN fact-finding mission. Indeed, the fact-finding missions concluded that rape and other sexual violence, including gang rape, sexually humiliating acts, sexual slavery, and sexual mutilations were perpetrated on a massive scale. Over many years, the Rohingya has been gradually stripped of access to legal documents, education, healthcare, or employment, as well as denial to participate in political processes, and the sexual and reproductive deprivations of this, denial of the sexual and reproductive health right, and do not enjoy freedom of movement that flows from that status. And this, again, exacerbated by a draconian system of local orders. All of these contexts provide fragile ground for the forced migration. The extensive administrative requirement for marriage, for example, they result in the inevitably poor family to pay for permission and leaving parents with no options but to send their daughters to Malaysia to marry. Indeed, many of the Rohingya women and adolescent girls were attempting to leave these situations of persecutions with wedding dresses packed in their bag. all of this harm that they have endured for many years, the Rohingya have been fleeing from Myanmar across the Andaman Sea for decades. In May of 2015, this came to the head as the state closes their border to boats, leaving some 5,000 Rohingya and Bengalis stranded at sea. While this was eventually resolved, people disembarked, there was a remarkable silence on these experiences of women and girls. This silence continue as women and girls continue to experience similar tragedies today. In our article, in our research, we interview women who survived this journey in 2015. Women and girls were without food, water, or access to menstrual hygiene, and many have died. The testimony said women were held hostage, women were taken away, girls were sold into child marriage, women were singled out and raped repeatedly, sometimes for months. This is the gendered experience of refugees, which is committed with entitlement and impunity. State fails to account for gendered natures of violence that women in interpreting customary law, international customary law, and key regional standards with deadly consequences. While there are a raft of international treaties which apply at sea, including CEDAW, where individuals within a state's jurisdictions, our research focuses on international customary law to demonstrate the global natures of the problem of sexual violence, whether women are fleeing by sea that require actions by state globally. We argue a few points. Number one, the prohibitions of sexual violence can be considered international customary law. This requires a positive obligations upon states to prevent and protect women, as well as ensure institutional measures to address these violations. Number two, owing to the severity of the gendered harm that Rohingya women face in Myanmar, on the basics of their ethnicity, they should be considered prima facie to be refugee and protect them from return to Myanmar by customary principles of international refugee law, notably the prohibition of refoulement. Number three, customary law of the sea principles relating to rescue at sea ought to have been applied to protect women, but did not. Instead, state failed to perform rescued or towed vessel back to the sea. Number four, situations was addressed through the law enforcement lens to prevent smuggling or trafficking. It focuses on the state security rather than dignity of the women and girls. This shut off road of escape for these women, forcing them into even more dangerous journey. In conclusions, the obligations to act is upon state. It cannot rest with the requirement that women and girls report incidents of sexual violence. This violence must be assumed to be taken place in the situations of a power imbalance. Women and girls may not report violence for a range of reasons, including stigma and shame, and in many cases, particularly in conflict-affected area, reprisal. Further, the recourse or legal or otherwise in many cases is not available, which means that it is unlikely for women to report the incident. Global evidences indicate that gendered violence must be assumed to increase in prevalent during humanitarian responses. When fleeing during displacements or upon return, it is not acceptable to need the evidence to interpret the law in a way that protects women. So I would end here And I would love to receive questions and answer any specific questions or broader questions around refugee protections or return or any other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you and your co-authors for bringing this important lens to the issue, because while we often talk about in broad terms the protection needs and protection concerns in relation to the Rohingya and others who are fleeing by sea, as your research points out, there is a subcategories of people with particular protection concerns that warrant that special attention. So we look forward to that forthcoming article, and I encourage all participants who have questions to please post those in the Q&A so that we can come back to them after the presentations. All right, our next speaker is Phil Robertson, who has extensive experience in the region and with this issue from 2015 and beyond to now. So Phil, please share your reflections.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the Kaldor Center for inviting me to present at this very important seminar. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to use some of my time to recount some of the history of the regional movements of the Rohingya and the obstacles they've faced to receiving recognition and protection. In terms of dealing with the Rohingya boat refugees, we really have come full circle. With no solution in sight in Myanmar, Bangladesh, no regional solution or even response plan in place in the ASEAN countries in the ASEAN region, and boat refugees now again heading out in rickety boats, again trying to reach Malaysia directly from Bangladesh. So you feel like a sense of deja vu, to be honest. And let me say at the outset that we associate ourselves with many of the recommendations made by the UNHCR representative. It was an impressive presentation on the things that need to be done and the urgency to address this situation. There are a number of solid recommendations we should discuss during the question and answer period. Now, quite a few people think that this crisis really dates back to 2015, when a Thai law enforcement action inadvertently exposed the Thai-Malaysia border camps and prompted a crackdown in the Rohingya boat people crisis. Or some people point to the Burmese Tatmadaws crimes against humanity and acts of genocide in Rakhine State in August 2017 that sent over 730,000 Rohingya fleeing across the border to Bangladesh. In fact, this crisis is much older than that, and it's important to understand the history to see how current movements by boats in the Andaman Sea and by land across Myanmar and Thailand more recently are recurrences of a continuing cycle that involve changing policies and responses of frontline states of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bangladesh. And the crisis also shows a continuing failure of Australia and of regional mechanisms like the Bali process and of course ASEAN and other world powers to deal with this situation, condemning it to continuously reoccur, perpetuating Rohingya misery while offering precious little real protection. This is part of the larger failure of regional frontline states to address what is a regional crisis and a searing indictment of the limitations of ASEAN as an organization that responds to such crises. To put it bluntly, there's a lot of blame to go around, and I think the only reason I'll spare anyone is if I run out of time for my presentation. First and foremost, however, let me put the primary blame on successive Myanmar governments and the Tatmadaw, or Myanmar military, who are at the heart of this problem going back all the way to 1978. The Rohingya are born and have lived all their lives in Myanmar, and they should be recognized as full Myanmar citizens. They are not from anywhere else. Myanmar must receive them back voluntarily with safety, protection, and full rights to citizenship, freedom of movement, right to livelihoods, right to return to their villages of origin and compensation for what they have lost, respect for their freedom of religion and belief, and accesses to services and education. This is non-negotiable. And for anyone who truly wants to resolve the Rohingya refugee crisis, they must be advocating for this and demanding that Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian NLD government of Myanmar, which was just re-elected in a landslide in November, make that happen. Bangladesh is right to demand that the global community place the blame at Myanmar's door and pressure the Myanmar government to resolve this problem. And the OIC and the EU are right to back them in that demand through the UN resolutions and other mechanisms. Sadly, so far, Myanmar is not listening. The Rohingya refugees have fled to Bangladesh in arguably 5 waves: 1978, 1991, 92, 2012, 2016, 2017. And Bangladesh has consistently insisted there be no local integration, has placed restrictions on access to services, education, housing, and livelihoods, has restricted freedom of movement, and committed rights abuses against the Rohingya. This is all part of a consistent strategy by Dhaka to make it clear to the Rohingya that they cannot stay, that they will have to go back to Rakhine State, the sooner the better. And the outrageous and unacceptable movement of the Rohingya to what is a de facto Rohingya Alcatraz island situation in Basan Char, the fencing of Cox's Bazar camps and the restrictions on housing and services are all part of the plan in Bangladesh to tell the Rohingya that they must go home. We have called on Bangladesh's government to end these transfers and to permit the UN to conduct a technical assessment of Basan Char, which cannot assume to be safe until that technical assessment has been done, and allow also UNHCR to assess whether the 3,000 Rohingya already on the island have moved there voluntarily or whether they wish to move back to the camps in Cox's Bazar. But a second unarticulated part of Bangladesh's strategy has been to look the other way as corrupt government officials and security forces, brokers, and smugglers arrange unofficial alternative exits. And this has meant the boat departures from Bangladesh, which Dhaka has traditionally seen as one of the ways to reduce the numbers of refugees. And this has remained a constant factor throughout the years. What has also remained constant factor throughout the years is a durable, adaptable, and cruel set of criminal syndicates composed of Rohingya, Bangladeshis, and others who have moved Rohingya by boats. Their efforts to secure exorbitant fees for moving people has been a continual variant that has helped determine how these movements have changed over time. And interestingly, direct boat departures from Rakhine State really didn't happen prior to 2013, when significant numbers of displaced Rohingya were locked down in open air detention camps masquerading as IDP camps, following the violence in central Rakhine State committed against the Rohingya and Kaman communities, including in the state capital, Sitwe. Until that period of time, Myanmar's Navy prevented such departures until basically the 2013, 2014, 2015 period, when the money to be made from the smugglers was too great to resist, and the government's policy apparently changed to getting the Rohingya to leave Rakhine State in any way possible. Right now, we're seeing increased departures of Rohingya from Rakhine State being smuggled overland through Yangon and onto the Thai-Burma border. And there have been more instances of Rohingya being caught in the outskirts of Yangon, in the Karen state capital of Pa'an, and the border crossing of Mayawadi Mesot, and even in Bangkok. So, for example, 19 Rohingya were arrested in the Don Mueang district of northern Bangkok earlier this month, and over 100 were arrested in northern Yangon in December. This is, I think, just the tip of the iceberg, and there are many more Rohingya who are now moving overland than we are able to count and assess. Now, the primary destination for Rohingya fleeing Bangladesh has always been Malaysia, where there is a sizable and growing Rohingya community, generally sympathetic government, at least until 2020. I'll say some more about that later, and ample manual labor jobs and a growing economy. This has also been a constant factor throughout the years. And despite the fact that the Rohingya are certainly refugees, it is also interesting to note that the Rohingya primarily seek that status once they get to Malaysia, but not in the process of movements through Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. We can discuss why in the question and answer session, but what is unfortunate, and it must be mentioned here, is that the new Perikatan Malaysia government, which took power in March 2020, has continuously denied access to newly arrived Rohingya and kept the UNHCR from accessing the immigration detention centers in the country since last year. This Malaysian government practice must change, and UNHCR must be provided timely and consistent access to asylum seekers and refugees wherever they are in Malaysia. Now, to the extent, and of course I recognize that there's an Australian audience here, to the extent that the Rohingya previously sought to go on boats to Australia and ended up in Nauru or on Manus Island, it's worth noting that the profile of those Rohingya were largely persons who had been resident and established themselves in Malaysia for a number of years and then were deciding to take the next step. And we can discuss that in the question and answer section as well. Now, what has changed the flows of Rohingya boat people were the policies of the frontline states like Thailand. Prior to 2007, 2008, Thailand simply treated the Rohingya as another group of Burmese to be arrested and deported to the Thai-Burma border. Actually, boats arrived on Thailand shores. Rohingya were arrested by immigration, held locally for a period of time, and then transferred to the main Bangkok immigration facility at Sunplu. From there, the Rohingya were sent to Mae Sot on the Thai-Burma border with other Burmese slated for deportation. However, these deportations were what we would call soft deportations, meaning that they were not being handed directly over to Burmese government officials, but rather pushed back across in an area controlled by ethnic Karen militias, in this case, the DKBA, who in cahoots with Thai immigration set up a hold and release extortion racket. And for the Rohingya, this worked fine because it meant they avoided the Burmese government refusal to consider them citizens to be taken back. The brokers would go and get the Rohingya out of DKBA detention, and for a price, illegally transport them by land across Thailand, usually in trucks and vans, to the Malaysian border and across. And this was how things proceeded for years. No one really cared, and thousands moved this way. But in 2009, Thailand changed its policy. The Thailand National Security Council decided that Rohingya were a security threat who should be arbitrarily denied access to asylum procedures in UNHCR, and also not permitted to arrive and remain in Thailand as migrant workers. And this Thailand policy continues until today and has been a constant factor shaping Rohingya refugee movements. This prompted the traffickers to try to send small boats all the way to Malaysia. And this is particularly difficult since the currents in the Indian Ocean, the Andaman Sea, with prevailing winds, push these boats inexorably to the Thai coast. Instead of allowing the Rohingya boats to land, the NSC at that time ordered the Thai Navy to intercept them at sea and detain them. And this was about the time in December 2008 that the journalists at Phuket One, Australian Alan Morrison, and Tutimas Siddhasathian documented Rohingya men being held on beaches in Surin Island by the Thai Navy personnel and then later disappearing. This was Thailand's infamous Rohingya pushback policy. It had been noticed by journalists. The Thai Navy was disabling motors on boats. They're handing out some water and some dry noodles and then towing these boats and the Rohingya passengers hundreds of miles out to sea, cutting them loose and letting them float away to die. And a number of boats of starving refugees ended up in Aceh or in India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands. When confronted with questions by journalists, the Thai government blatantly lied that they were doing any such thing. In January 2009, Prime Minister Apisit Vejjajiva chaired a meeting of the Thailand's National Security Council and authorized the Navy to intercept intercom boats and detain the passengers in offshore holding centers. The problem was that there wasn't any offshore holding centers, and the pushbacks continued until Dan Rivers and CNN obtained a tape from some conscientious Thai Navy personnel showing a Rohingya boat being towed out to sea for hours. That was broadcast all around the world, drawing huge waves of international condemnation to Thailand. Prime Minister Apisit admitted it happened, claimed that they would investigate and hold people responsible and accountable, but they didn't. Publicly, the Thais then adopted what was called the help-on policy, in which the Thai Navy would resupply boats with food, water, and petrol, tow them out a little bit, and then send them in the direction of Malaysia, which was in fact where the Rohingyas wanted to go. The Thai leaders could claim to the international community the Rohingya pushbacks had stopped. Indeed, that was the case, but that was only because corruption had reared its ugly head. And instead, what the policy became what I call the help yourselves policy, with Thai officials capturing Rohingya boats and then doing deals to sell them to traffickers. The traffickers would then land the boats as officials looked the other way, transport Rohingya overland to the Andaman coast, to the jungle detention camps in the Thai-Malaysian borders. And that set the stage for what would ultimately be exposed in 2015, the Rohingya trafficking camps in the Thai-Malaysia jungles, in the involvement of senior Thai officials, including Internal Security Operations Command, Navy, and other personnel in this trade. We can talk more about that during the question and answers period, since I know my time is limited. When those camps were utterly shut down, that was what then led to the Thai, Malaysian, Indonesian policies, what we term ping pong pushbacks to sea, boats going missing, people dying, because people had been coming into these camps. And all of a sudden, when the camps closed, it was like somebody turned off the faucet. You couldn't get through. And so finally, an emerging agreement and a regional conference ended up with the Malaysian, Indonesian governments agreeing to receive boats and Thailand continuing its irresponsible policy. The post-2015 situation has been characterized by obviously outflows over the 700,000 Rohingya to Bangladesh. And what we're seeing also is an increased lockdown nature of detention for the remaining 600,000 or so Rohingya who still in Rakhine State, including 130,000 in so-called IDP camps, where Human Rights Watch recently found that they are victims of international rights crimes of apartheid and persecution. This is, by the way, the first time Human Rights Watch has determined that the crime of apartheid is happening in Asia. And our report, An Open Prison Without End, details those findings, and it's on our website. You can download it for free. And a struggle now is that the Rohingya trafficking syndicates are trying to reconstitute a business model that works for them. And that's why we've seemed to return to a pre-2008 model of small boats trying to make it all the way to Malaysia. So we have really come full circle back to the 2008 model. But the problem, and this is an issue that also needs to be dealt with, is that Malaysia's positive reception for Rohingya is no longer a given. We've seen anti-foreigner xenophobia combined with COVID-19 pandemic fears and a change of government to the Perikatan Nasional government of Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin. And increasingly it shows that the more Rohingya are not welcome. And in fact, actually this past April, there was a massive hate speech campaign on social media against the Rohingya. I think that astonished everyone, reminding many people of the bad old days of hate speech against the Rohingya in Myanmar. So
Sorry, Phil, I might have to cut you off shortly.
Yeah, no, we're now at a point where we have a situation where we have returned to an original model without any solutions along the way. And in fact, we have a greater demand for emergency action because of the huge numbers in Bangladesh. So I'll leave it there. Obviously, there's a lot to cover during the question and answer period. And thank you again.
Thank you, Phil. It's incredibly important to have that historical context to put what happened in 2015 into broader perspective, not just focusing from there forward. So thank you for that. And I think it's also a nice point at which to segue on to Steve Wong, who will be talking to us, I believe, also about the situation in Malaysia. So thank you. Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Madeline. I would like to begin by thanking the Caldor Center and yourself for reaching out to the Asia Dialogue for Forced Migration. I'll try and be pretty smart about my presentation today. There are only two topics. One is you've asked to find out more about the ADFM and a little bit about what we do, so I'll spend some time there. And then I think the second is to take up from Phil and describe the perspectives from a host country, which is Malaysia, as it's been emphasized by previous speakers as well today. Okay, so with that, can you all see that? Yes? Okay. So thank you again. We are called the Asia Dialogue for Forced Migration. We've been around for about 6 years. We actually started in the year of the Andaman Sea crisis and got involved. And while we are concerned about forced migration in general within Asia, of course, this Rohingya, the crisis, has actually been one of the very important topics that has dominated all our meetings. We are a track 1.5 forum, which means that we include both government officials, NGOs, international bodies. UNHCR has, regularly participates. So there's IOM and other international bodies from Geneva, okay? And we are basically set up to do consultations, research, advice on forced migration matters. There are 4 co-conveners. Australia is the Center for Policy Development. Indonesia is LIPI, which is the Indonesian Institute for Sciences, which is actually government. In Thailand, it is the Institute for Peace and Human Rights from Mahidol. And Malaysia, until a year ago, it was ISIS Malaysia, and now it's just me while we try to reorganize ourselves. All participation is in a personal capacity. So this means, you don't bring along all your official position papers, etc. We want to have discussions. In the 5 years, we have traditionally tried to meet twice a year, the early part of the year, and we have managed to have 9 meetings, Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and the last one, which we were able to hold, which was in February 2020. We continue to have other bilateral meetings and engagements with government and international organizations between the meetings. And as I said, the key focus of the Rohingya displacement, we've had 2 visits to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. we are seeking at some stage to be able to allow to go to Rakhine State, which is, I'll mention that again. And we also had one visit here in 2017 when we had the meeting here to interview and to find out more about the Rohingya communities who are hosted in Malaysia. We write reports, memos, articles, blog posts. We try to distinguish ourselves from other fora by being open, frank, and multi-perspective, but we try and do so in an informal, kind of friendly environment. So, you will see a lot of people wearing ties and coats, but generally that's not required. We try to focus on short, medium, and long-term issues of importance and impacts. Each meeting has got various briefs and papers in support of them. And we are able to do this simply because there's a lot of goodwill and voluntary, participation by the co-conveners as well as the other participants, and real belief in what we are doing. We encourage participants to, towards in the meetings and after the meetings, to try and translate their proposals into workable processes, whether this is on the part of governments and or anyone really. And we also undertake post-meeting follow-up. On the Rohingya specifically, we won't talk about the other parts of the ADFM agenda like climate change, migration, or detention. Yes, it's already been mentioned. Safe, voluntary, and dignified repatriation is the only durable solution. Approaches must be involve comprehensive and integrated international, regional, and bilateral cooperation. Probably we want to underline the word integrated, because right now they're being conducted quite in an ad hoc manner. The interests of key stakeholders, including governments and the affected communities, must be recognized for there to be practical and tangible progress. And I think 2021 will be a critical year for progressing more of these effective responses to the crisis, given the elections in Myanmar, in the US, and the lead up to the 20th anniversary of the Bali process in 2022. Before I go further, let me just say that the issue of deaths at sea, of the boats, and the conditions in the camp is an annual affair, just as every year, all right, there is the whole issue of funding and the provision of services. Every year there is the concern about the severity of the monsoons, all right, and whether or not lives will be lost, during those times. Now, the key milestones, you can have a quick look at it. We have done 2 substantive reports. Not all of them are available to sort of the public, but we started actually with a request to do a review. This is by Bali Process Ad Hoc Group on the review of the Andaman Sea crisis, all right? And there's some proposals that we made there that were very quickly adopted. By the way, we came up with a co-convener statement on the severity of the Rohingya crisis in December of 2016, after the Andaman Sea crisis, but before the August 2017, thing in Putidong and in the other parts. We've also write articles. We've come up with statements. We made a statement to the senior officials in Bali, actually. Bali Process Senior Official Meeting, Bali. We have come up with a tip assessment. This has also been looked at by IOM, actually kind of encouraged and co-sponsored by IOM and UNHCR, which we call avoiding a crisis within a crisis. We have come up with our latest March 2020 co-convener statement, and we subsequently convened a high-level roundtable on forced migration, where we tried to bring in the new representative from Canada, into the discussions. So that's on ADFM. There is more information on the CPD website. There's a link right at the beginning of this where you can access that. Now, let me take up from where Phil has sort of mentioned about Malaysia and give you a little bit more color and situational perspectives on what has actually transpired in 2020. Malaysia currently hosts what is people call the 4th largest community of Rohingya in the world. in terms of UNHCR registrations, it's about 100,000, as Keen has pointed out, but there are those that are not sort of registered. We don't know how many there are, okay? And this constitutes about close to 90% of the total population that we know of, okay, within Malaysia. Now, it is a destination of choice, as has been emphasized. So when you go to the Cox's Bazar camps, you go to Thailand, you go to Myanmar, they all say, Malaysia is that way. So please find your way over there, okay? Because, so everyone is totally in agreement that Malaysia should be the host country. Malaysia as a host country, though, it has to be understood. The country has a policy, a discretionary policy. There are probably three elements to this policy. One is to be free of international obligations, which there was a time when, during the very short time when the Pakatan Harapan government, before it was chucked out in February of last year, actually made, in one of its promises to be a signatory to the Convention for Refugees. They did not move that very fast. And I think we've gone back now to status quo, which is to be free of international obligations, both legal as well, the protocol, as well as public opinion. At the same time, the long-standing policy is actually we want to show global Muslim solidarity with the Muslim world. And this extends not only to the Rakhine state, it's also the Palestine, it also reach out to the Syrians, the Bosnians, etc. So this show of global Muslim solidarity sits very well with the local population and actually enhances Malaysia's standing in terms of the IOC countries. But at the same time, we do want to meet national security and political needs, which means that this policy vacillates from time to time, okay? And now I think we are beginning to see that. Now, the policy is far, far, far from perfect, but it did serve one essential purpose until 2020, is that with all the vacillations, etc., it still served some humanitarian purpose. But as had been pointed out, the public sentiment has been turning increasingly negative, with greater perceived competition with locals, etc. Things that you find even within Bangladesh, and a new thing, which is the security fears, leading to, in April, what Phil has called something like a Myanmar-like, on sort of social media, a demonization of the sort of Rohingya. A big part of this was started off actually by a so-called quote-unquote Rohingya leaders' demand for citizenship. By the way, restrictions on movements and sort of lockdowns and clampdowns began in the middle of March. And as a result, many of the undocumented refugees, or even documented sort of refugees by UNHCR, were unable to make a living. They were locked down in certain areas. And this Rohingya so-called leader, which other groups have denied that he is the leader, demand for citizenship. And this actually kind of brought together this big public backlash. And this led the Home Minister to come up with this no status, no rights, no basis for any demands, okay? And the pushback of both continued. Then in May, they constituted a national task force. And this task force is basically to harden the borders. If the borders were not already hard enough, but to harden the borders, both maritime and land borders, primarily in Peninsular Malaysia, but now moving also to East Malaysia for other sort of people who cross. At the same time, there was an operation of detention. There are two kinds of operation. This special operation, which is nationwide, and then there is also the other operations of when they have to restrict down movement in certain areas. In June, at the ASEAN summit, actually, Malaysia, the Prime Minister announced this policy. Malaysia can no longer accept Rohingya. So who is he talking to? He's talking to other ASEAN leaders, all right? And ASEAN states and UN bodies must, and get this, do more to help Myanmar. This contrasts with 2016, when the Prime Minister of the day then, Najib Abdul Razak, actually participated in a pro-Rohingya anti-Myanmar rally in Kuala Lumpur. I think it's the first time we've ever known of a serving prime minister to participate within a demonstration. Okay. And then in the consultations between ASEAN and the UN, UNDP in November, the Prime Minister called for proportionate burden and responsibility sharing, underscored, I love this phrase, in the Global Compact on Refugees to solve the issue of the Rohingya. So I'm not sure that they fully understand what this entails, but a proportionate burden and responsibility sharing underscored by GCR is this in Myanmar, in Cox's Bazar. What about Malaysia? And this, the National Task Force, which is to harden borders, push back boats, prevent people from crossing, etc., is now talked about as being to continue even after the COVID-19 pandemic, whenever that is. Okay.
Sorry,
Now,
Steve, we might need to wrap it up shortly and then we can save the rest for questions if that's all right.
Okay. Rohingya in Malaysia, they're not having a very good time of it. We have indefinite detention, separation, in excess, etc. Okay. They are, the government, like all governments, naturally rejects the criticism of its detention measures. And in fact, you know, especially now with the rising infection rates. And on top of the National Task Force, there is now a nationwide state of emergency that lasts until August and may go beyond that. Now, in terms of just three things in moving forward, this whole issue is, I think we have to do practical steps to relieve human suffering now. And that is food provision, health, especially given the COVID, etc., and safety from persecution, torture, and trafficking. Okay, that's the most important, I think. Now, everything else has to be subject to that. The national governments and their sovereignty, they will stand up there and they can block you, right? And they have blocked you. That's why of this full circle that Phil Robertson talks about. So we want to, we need to take that into account, and that is why we are, one of the things that we're working on, for example, is the possibility of government-sanctioned, internationally organization-run and donor-sponsored safe zones, not camps, safe zones, for them to be able to get what they need within the sort of areas during these times. In the longer term, for the last 2 years, we've been working on the prospects on regional development as a means to, this whole thing about rising tide floats all ships, okay? And to apply that to both Cox's Bazar in the south, where they have development plans, Rakhine State, where they have development plans, but no one is actually talking to each other, and to find this like has been done elsewhere within Asia. Okay, so let me stop there and wait for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Steve and to all of our speakers for what has been an excellent series of presentations. And thank you to the audience for beginning to post through your questions and vote on the questions that are there. We now have about half an hour left to start going through those questions and have a bit more of an interactive dialogue. So please continue to post the questions. And then in order to kick off the Q&A, I might pose a question first to Keen, but then opening it up to all of the panel. We've been receiving a lot of questions around this issue of safe, voluntary, dignified and sustainable repatriation, return, reintegration for the Rohingya to Myanmar. So some questions have asked, what do you consider to be the critical issues around return? And specifically looking at the fact that the Rohingya have grappled with the issue of citizenship. So what are the ways that that issue might be addressed? And finally, the point has been made that we've had many conferences, many platforms where the Rohingya have voiced their needs, what they would need to be in place for return home. What is being done to address root causes? So a series of questions all along that same issue, which is clearly coming through as something important. Keen, would you like to have a first shot at answering some of those?
Sure, thanks, Madeline. Yeah, I mean, our operations in Myanmar and Bangladesh, as well as some of the other host countries, are often in touch with Rohingya about, what they would like to see in Rakhine to be able to even consider returning. And I think some of the key issues can be boiled down to freedom of movement. As I highlighted, this remains, a structural issue because it prevents Rohingya from accessing all their basic services, opportunities, and livelihoods and education. So that, that the local restrictions in place on Rohingya from moving between villages or townships, those certainly need to be lifted. Education is a key issue. It's related to freedom movement because there's no access to move to places of education, but also the quality of education in Rakhine State needs to be improved. And it can be done in tandem with the efforts we're making in Bangladesh to introduce the Myanmar curriculum to Rohingya children there. Preserving the housing, land, and property rights of the displaced in Rakhine is very important for both the refugees as well as the internally displaced, ensuring that they're able to return to their original house plots and don't have those appropriated by others. The IDP issue is really a critical one because refugees are watching what happens to Rohingya IDPs in Rakhine and whether they can eventually return to their places of origin with freedom of movement. And then on the really, the fundamental issue of citizenship, of course, the goal in the long term must be amendment to the citizenship law so that it's not based on these 135 ethnicities that the 1982 citizenship law stipulates. In the meantime, while we all continue to kind of work on that, there are some things that can be done. There are those who are already eligible under the current law who should be able to be granted citizenship. The NVC process, the National Verification Card process that the government had started, could be reviewed. It must be voluntary. This was a recommendation by Myanmar's own Independent Commission of Inquiry. And then at a kind of very basic level, ensuring that Rohingya children have their births registered. And that has been a problem for many years now. There's been a national push under the new child rights law in Myanmar to expand birth registration and through mobile stations, and that can certainly be expanded to Rohingya to ensure that they're at least documented from birth.
Thank you very much. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on the issue of return?
I would just say that it's very important that how the Rohingya who are currently in Rakhine State are treated is recognized as a key indicator of how the Rohingya in Bangladesh will determine to return. The fact that you have over 130,000 of these internally displaced persons essentially locked down in open air detention centers without freedom of movement, that you have a so-called IDP closure process, which is basically locking people down with slightly better housing right next to the previous camp, raise some fundamental issues about what the intentions of the government of Myanmar are. And without any sort of significant change, that information is being relayed by Rohingya to their relatives in the camps in Bangladesh. And people are not going to return to a situation where they essentially are returned to a locked down, controlled camp in Rakhine State, because they are afraid that the people who are guarding them, the police and the military, may in fact violate their human rights again.
When we were in Cox's Bazar, it's very interesting. When we interview the Rohingya, many of them youths, all right? So probably did most of their growing up within these sort of camps. They said they want to go back to Myanmar. So now it's a matter of the degree to which of a sort of compromise. Is it enough, for example, if you have a pathway to citizenship without a right before you cross over? Is it etc.? So what are, where's the wiggle room in terms of this? But whatever it is, we had the situation 2 years ago where things really hot up between Myanmar blaming Bangladesh for not wanting to release, all right? I mean, it's a unthinkable thing, but the accusation was that Bangladesh wanted to keep all this good money for itself from international donors and did not want to release. And Bangladesh is saying, this is ridiculous. We have given you these names and etc., but you're not doing enough. Now it appears that they are that there's a proposal now for a tripartite thing, all right, which is supposed to take place anytime soon, with India, with other sponsoring states, etc., which is actually not a bad idea, except that it it does not include China, which is plus or minus, etc. So the more international participation and the less bilateral it becomes, maybe this is the way to go forward in terms of the return and repatriation program.
So one of the things that which we see as a community member of the community is when we talk about the solutions in all of the discussions, bilateral, trilateral, or the discussions within the UN, between UN organizations, or even the UNHCR, we don't see the Rohingyas' voices that much. We don't see Rohingya are being consulted or involved in any of these decision-making processes, or the drafting all of the solutions. And I think that is a very, very important issue that we need to raise and talk and call for. So regarding the repatriations, in addition to what has been said, we find, I just want to highlight three things among those. In addition to basics right to education, health movement, the refugees are looking for three key areas, as has been said. The citizenship. When we talk about citizenship, it's full citizenship. So right now, government is in Myanmar, government is issuing this national verification card, and then many people are somehow volunteering to apply for naturalized citizenship, to apply for the citizenship, and then eventually they are getting naturalized citizenship, which is second-class citizenship in Myanmar. So basically, they have created a situation that people have no choices but to accept whatever it is. So when we talk about voluntariness, it is important that which condition, which context we're talking about. So, we need to be able to clear on whether this voluntariness is the last choice that people have or not. So, but right now we're calling, generally we are, as a community, we're calling to halt this national verification process and then restore the full citizenship rights, the same citizenship card as Rakhine or Burmese. So that's one thing. And secondly, about the return and restitutions of their properties and land, return to their places of origin. So even for the people in Rakhine State, the IDPs and those displaced people who are not IDPs, the government somehow, planning or already building this so-called model villages, and which is like a small tent of 20 to 15 feet. And then they're planning to relocate these IDPs and displaced people in those areas instead of returning and ensuring to their return to their places of origin. So this is one very important factor that the refugees are looking for. They want to return to their places of origin, right? And thirdly, about safety and security. There are still lists of people in the at the security police stations or by the security that they have issued to arrest. So the young refugees, especially men, boys and men, are worried about returning to their place, to home, whether if they return, they would be arrested or not. So there is no guarantee or assurance of the safety and security in this so-called bilateral agreement. So I think these are three key factors that the refugees are considering in addition to other basics necessity.
Thank you very much. And some of the other questions have also flagged that issue of Rohingya participation in decision-making and planning. So it's an important point that you make there. Thank you. If we can stick with you, Weiwei, for a bit longer, there's another question here for you, which is that you mentioned the ICC. this audience member says, many scholars dismiss it as a kind of tool of Western imperialism. Do you see it as helpful in holding perpetrators to account, or does it also make things difficult? In other words, can this body be seen as an important ally for women and girls and their advocates in the Global South?
Sure. So I think when we talk about addressing the situations, the Rohingya crisis, it is important to have a comprehensive approach, which include acknowledging the crimes that happen against them, and then taking holding perpetrators accountable. There are several UN reports and many government reports that indicate the crimes that happen against Rohingyas are crimes against humanity or and the genocide. So therefore, ICC has initiated its own investigations, which is looking at the crimes of forced deportation under crimes against humanity. It will not cover the entire the crimes that happens against the populations. It will cover only a segment of it. So I think it is important that we acknowledge the whole crimes and all the crimes that occurred against them, and then discuss at the international fora, discuss to form sort of accountability mechanisms or court. Like basically, we are talking about ICC referral from the Security Council or creations of an ad hoc tribunal, because right now the jurisdiction that ICC has is very limited, so it will not cover everything. So that is why I think it is important we look into the situations in a more constructive and holistic manner, and then address accountability as a whole, and then also, in parallel, going into discussing about peace and reconciliations or and the return. None of these are happening right now into the level that it's supposed to be. So this is where we are, and I believe more aggressive advocacy and work has to be done.
Thank you very much. So return and accountability are two of the biggest issues that arise in this issue, and we've covered them. But what's coming through in the questions is a sense of frustration or trying to push through that, because the idea is that both of those things are not necessarily forthcoming in the immediate future. So there are a lot of questions here saying, what are some concrete steps that should be taken now? What are some actions that should be occurring in the meantime, given that return is not viable imminently, and that accountability is perhaps not forthcoming or making a difference immediately? And some of the groups that have been raised in the questions include ASEAN, the Bali process, perhaps the Global Compact for Refugees, various initiatives such as these. What should other states in the region be doing, states like Australia? So I thought I might open that generally to panellists to reflect on what are some concrete, immediate, short to mid-term actions which could and should be taken by states, by advocates, and by regional organisations. Is there anyone who'd like to start?
I'll say a few things. I mean, obviously ASEAN has continually failed to take this up. And this is a big problem. I mean, that's part of the nature of ASEAN, which is that you have the veto process where one state can veto it, and Myanmar has continued to veto any sort of discussion of this. So, it's critical, I think, to sort of consider a sort of alternative frontline state collective discussing these issues. And, that involves Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Bangladesh, with the support of other countries. And, I would hope that they would find a way to come together to try to collectively bargain with Myanmar about how to resolve the situation and have the Rohingya return to Rakhine State in safety and dignity and with adequate protection. You know, unfortunately, the Bali process, which was heralded as the big solution during the 2015 crisis, has, you know, despite one declaration in 2016, done very little since then. You know, even efforts to sort of initiate the consultative mechanism have failed. You know, I think Australian government interest has flagged on this after it became clear that the Rohingya were not going to be able to make it to Australia by boat. You know, I think there's been a real failure of Australian leadership at the Bali process, and that has been compounded by a lack of interest in Indonesia and other governments taking forward efforts without Australian leadership. You know, you would have to ask yourself, really, what has the Bali process produced in terms of discussions and solutions for the Rohingya? And the answer has to be absolutely nothing.
Any of the other panelists who'd like to come in and talk about regional initiatives, states, advocates, we're thinking about short to mid-term concrete actions that might be taken.
Hi, Matt. I can come in on a couple of things inside Myanmar. So on this topic of regional institutions in ASEAN specifically, you know, ASEAN has a couple entry points in Rakhine State through the AHA Center and also the ad hoc support team that's been set up, and that's good that they're there and they're trusted by the Myanmar officials. I think what would be helpful is if there can be they can be encouraged to align their own work with implementation of the Advisory Commission recommendations to address some of the root causes. And there are concrete things in kind of each of the categories I mentioned on what refugees are looking for when they're thinking about returning home. So on freedom of movement, for example, you know, there has been a push to end the detention and criminal sanctions against Rohingya who are caught traveling within Myanmar. And we've seen some progress on that. So Rohingya don't have freedom of movement clearly in the country, but those who have been caught are no longer, for now, sentenced to imprisonment, but are being returned to Rakhine State. That is an improvement, and we can work for more sort of incremental improvements like that. On IDPs, there is now a national strategy that the Myanmar government is trying to implement with all the right principles, and we need to make sure those are complied with in the implementation, but it's another entry point. And then, as I mentioned on citizenship, there are those few initiatives on birth registration, on issuing citizenship to those who are already eligible under the current law. Those are, you know, again, incremental, but they can be signs of progress and building confidence in improving conditions in Rakhine.
Could I add one point to that, which is that as we were doing the research connected to the access to some of those IDP camps in Rakhine State, that there's a gauntlet that has been created by the government of Myanmar to make it extremely difficult for access for international NGOs and agencies and others to get access to those areas. And this continues to be a problem. I mean, anybody you talk to who works in Rakhine State is talking about the difficulty of getting the necessary authorizations to travel and do work in these camps. And that is a fundamental problem, which is easily within the power of the government of Myanmar to solve.
Thank you. Weiwei.
Yes, I want to say two things. I mean, as a role for ASEAN governments, obviously, I think, you know, what they have initiated, a couple of those AHA Center or dialogue discussions with the government. I think one of the things that they can do is to facilitate dialogues between the Rohingya and Myanmar government, or perhaps include other stakeholders as well, for example, Rakhine or others. So I think that is not happening. You know, so far discussions are out of Rohingya are out of the discussions until now. So I think they have this leverage and opportunity to assist or facilitate on this. And a second point is that the ASEAN involvement should not be a barrier or should not be a means for Myanmar government to avoid or to shy away from the international, to take actual action, effective action and actual actions, and to avoid international pressure. Or the ASEAN initiative should not be a barrier to in bringing justice and accountability. As I said, without addressing justice and accountability issues, we will not be able to rebuild the society or find any solution. So it is important that ASEAN governments support this initiative, at the same time, assist and fill the gap that by using the engagement and the relationship they have with the Myanmar government, by leveraging their relationship with Myanmar government.
Thank you. Steve, you're muted, but did you want to come in on that question as well?
Organizations, whether they are Bali Process, ASEAN, or even sub-regional, they are good at what they are, and they are, and there are certain things that when we ask of them, all right, they are good at undertaking maybe consultations. The AHA Center was actually a technical study. Now, it was a big move because this is the first time that ASEAN is involved, but it is a technical study on the needs of Rakhine for this blah, 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 which the AHA Center itself was not equipped to do, because the AHA Center is supposed to respond to things like natural calamities and earthquakes and things like that. I'm not even sure they have the required expertise in those areas, but doing a technical needs assessment was not sort of one of them, but it was a first sort of approach, and the sort of Myanmar kind of said, yes, you can do this study. I know that the Secretary General of ASEAN himself is the one who is tasked by the ministers, on this issue of the Rohingya. So nothing less than that. But what he's able to do, he has to go back to the sort of ASEAN states. So you can ask, dogs to jump through hoops, but sometimes, they can do what they can do, all right? It's not that they don't have a particular intention, but, obviously, if you have 10 inclusive trying to do, let alone, Bali Process, which is 50 over, all right, it becomes harder. So I think stick to that, but make it integrated. I think at the end of the day, even Bali Process has made good officers visits to Myanmar. These have not been highly publicized because, from both sort of things, but to go down there and to have dialogues with, on this particular issue. So they are doing. So, we've got behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, etc. All right. Nevertheless, very clear, ASEAN can do more, and now Malaysia's position is, we can't bear this burden, ASEAN, you have to do more, which I don't know what they are capable of doing or are able to do. The higher you raise the bar on this, the more difficult it is. I mean, is that sort of logically implausible? So the more things you pile onto this, onto the truck, the harder it is for it to move, right? So the most important thing, in my view, and this is a personal view, is keep them out of harm's way, all right? No more Rohingya going down to the bottom of the Indian Ocean, no more being washed away, within the camps. Stabilize that situation while you work for the others. Now, if I were to ask the other panelists and you won't answer this, but which is more important now? Is it to put all the Tamador, generals who are responsible, or the paramilitaries in jail before, before the Rohingya will feel safe? Or is it important to get them out of harm's way while these things are sort of going on? So what particularly are the priorities now? All right, that's the question that I would like to sort of throw in there.
Sure, happy to answer. It's a great question, and it's not a strange question. I think both of them are very important. We need to make sure that the refugees and the Rohingya, everywhere are safe. That's the primary responsibility of Myanmar and all other regional governments. It is they have responsibility to protect these people under international law. And we need to ensure that that is happening. And that is our priority as well. At the same time, we also need to address the root causes, which include this impunity that has been enjoyed by the Burmese government or all the perpetrators in the country. Without addressing this issue of accountability, without ending this accountability, we will not be able to stop the suffering of the people, whether at the sea or in the refugee camp. Therefore, it is equally important to address both issues. And if we compromise on the root causes or addressing accountability issues for the sake of convenience, we will not be able to address any of this issue at the end of the day.
Thank you, Weiwei. We have only 3 minutes left, so we're definitely down to time, but the top rated question, and I'm sorry we can't get to them all, the top rated question that's been voted on relates to the change in administration in the US today and asking what effect that change might have on Myanmar's position on the global stage, perhaps for 30-second sound bites each from the panelists, not just the US, but other questions here raise China, Japan, Australia, the key actors outside those that are immediately impacted. What do we need to start seeing from these states if we're going to see a change? Phil, would you like to come in first?
Yes, thank you. I mean, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Tony Blinken basically said he was going to look at the issue of whether genocide was committed in Rakhine State against the Rohingya. I think that's important. I think that the US government is going to play a bigger role on human rights issues. I also think that with the restarting of refugee resettlement, that there may be a way to restart discussions about Rohingya refugees going to the United States as they were going prior to the Trump administration. I think that the issue of accountability needs to be addressed. It's important to understand that accountability is not just about justice, but it's also about removing from the dynamic some of the people who have opposed the changes to allow the Rohingya to enjoy their rights. And that includes some of the top military people as well in Myanmar. There needs to be justice, but there also needs to be removing these people from the dynamic so that you actually have problem solvers who can step forward and have the political will to make changes.
Thank you very much. And just perhaps for the last comment, one last minute, Keen, did you want to comment perhaps on what UNHCR would like to start seeing from some of the bigger actors outside the region?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think it's not just about humanitarian or financial support. It really is about building on the relationships they have. So the U.S. has some relationships in the region, China does, Japan does, and they all have different entry points. They all can make their own unique contributions, but certainly kind of in a more comprehensive way, looking towards solutions and not just sort of maintaining humanitarian assistance. I think that will be very beneficial.
All right. Thank you. Well, we're right on time. I'm so sorry that we feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this topic and there are a lot of unanswered questions still, but we must go now because we have our next session coming up on climate change. So please, I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their time today, all of the audience for attending and for asking questions. And hopefully this conversation can continue because it is very important. So thank you to all the speakers and to the audience.
Thank you.